the Security Council. My name is Michael Bröning. I'm the head of the FES office here in New York, and it's my pleasure to sort of chair today's debate. The topic, of course, is Germany in the Security Council. Germany is just going to finish up its 2-year stint as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. And of course, the question that is of interest to Germans, but I suppose also of interest to anyone who's impacted by the action or inaction of the Security Council is, how did we do? And I'm very happy and very pleased to welcome Richard Gowan to share his insights and his observations with us today. And many of you, of course, know Richard. He is the director of the UN Office of the International Crisis Group, and he has done lots of things before that. He was involved with the European Council on Foreign Relations, with the New York University Center on International Cooperation, and he has taught at Columbia University and in Stanford, and he has worked for several UN institutions, and he wrote a weekly column. So he's an excellent person to speak with, and that's just what we are going to do in the coming hour or so. We are recording this session, so if you ask questions, please be so kind and introduce yourself. I think I'm going to chat with Richard for about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to open the floor, and I'm looking very much forward to the debate. In preparation for today's event, I Googled around a little bit, and I came across the recording of a discussion in the German parliament, the German Bundestag, that took place a couple of days ago, where the Bundestag took 1 hour, set 1 hour apart, and they discussed Germany's performance in the Security Council. And perhaps predictably, opinions varied, to say the least. And I wanted to share some of the comments that were mentioned in that parliamentary debate on 26th of November, I think it was. So from the Liberal Party, the FDP, there was harsh criticism that Germany did not do enough to push for the reform of the Security Council. From Die Linke, Heike Hensel, there was a criticism that there were only meager results for peace. And Heike Hensel also lambasted the fact that Germany failed to sign the nuclear ban treaty. From the Green Party, Omid Nouripur, foreign policy spokesperson, Omid Nouripur complained that there was lots of symbolism, but little to show for. And he even came to the conclusion that Germany's performance in the Security Council was shameful, a shameful balance sheet because of ongoing weapon exports from Germany to Turkey and other countries. And of course, perhaps also predictably from the far right AfD, we had a very harsh condemnation of what the AfD considers a very mistaken focus on women, because obviously from the AfD perspective, that is an, I quote, ideological feel-good topic, end of quote. So that's what the German opposition parties had to say about what Germany was doing in the Security Council. And obviously the German government has a bit of a different approach. And just yesterday, an assessment was published, Deutschlands Mitgliedschaft im Sicherheitsrat eine Bilanz, so basically a stock taking of Germany's track record in the Security Council. And there the German government itself comes to the assessment that Germany acted as, I quote, a bridge builder and an impulse generator in the 2 years in the Security Council. So that's the spectrum of opinions that we have in Berlin, and I'm looking forward to hearing Richard Gowan's perspective on what has come to pass or what has not come to pass in the Security Council with Germany in it in the last 2 years. And I was hoping to get a more nuanced assessment, and perhaps we can manage to move away from sort of stereotypical, radicalism that sort of oscillates between self-flagellation, moral grandstanding, and false modesty, perhaps. Maybe we can chart the territory in between these extremes. And so my first question to you, Richard, as a person who has really followed events very closely in the last 2 years, is, from your personal perspective, what do you think were the big achievements and perhaps also the failures of Germany's stint in the Security Council?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's great to be here, and I see some old friends and the names of some old friends in the Zoom, so I think we're going to have a good chat. I mean, look, I would start by saying that my overall assessment of Germany's time in the Council is positive. And I say that as someone who watches the day-to-day diplomacy of the Council, and sees how different members are playing the UN game, as it were. And I know that when you look at the UN from a long distance, it can seem disappointing. And I know that seen from a distance, it does feel like Germany may not have achieved everything that it had wanted. For example, Berlin wasn't able to get a resolution on the linkages between climate change and conflict. But when you look at it close up, you see a different picture. Firstly, you see that the last 2 years have been exceptionally difficult times diplomatically at the UN. This has been a period in which the Trump administration has been increasingly negative and increasingly disruptive in Security Council debates, even more so than in the first 2 years of Trump's term. It's been a period in which Russia has been, I think, even more aggressive than usual, frankly, over issues like Syria. And it's been a period in which China, which used to be quite cautious in Security Council diplomacy, has become considerably more assertive. And we saw some of these dynamics playing out at the start of this year, where the Council was unable to pass a resolution on COVID for over 3 months because China and the US were bickering about language around whether to call the virus the Wuhan virus, an absurd situation. And so Germany has been trying to advance its priorities through the Council in horrible, horrible circumstances. And I give it a lot of credit for that. Secondly, I think that I would emphasize that the German team here get very good reviews from other Council members. The German diplomats sometimes have a reputation for being a bit too focused on process issues, but actually others, including P5 members, would say that Christoph Heusgen and his team, are actually very good tactically, very hardworking, I think very popular with a lot of other Council members. So overall, there's an impression of competence. And then, we have seen Berlin get its hands dirty and try and make progress on some very hard files against, quite a bleak backdrop. So, Germany has been a key force in very gradually moving UN mediation in Libya forward this year. And especially after the Berlin conference in January, it was really only German pressure that made the Security Council do anything at all about Libya. Similarly, after the fall of President Bashir in Sudan, Germany and the UK have been pushing forward UN planning on how to support the Sudanese transition to civilian rule. And, I don't actually think that in previous terms, Germany would have got so involved in a sub-Saharan African security issue. But Heusgen and his team sort of were very, very centrally involved in those discussions. So I actually think that Germany has been doing quite a lot for peace, whatever one of the Bundestag members said. The results are always frustrating. Even in good times, you don't get clean, easy wins in the Security Council. You move a process forward and then you have to leave after 2 years, which is very frustrating. But on some of the things I've been talking about, Libya, Sudan, Afghanistan as well, I think Germany has been moving the process forward. And so seen close up, I give it, I think, higher marks than some of our friends back in Berlin.
I mean, this brings to mind the infamous or perhaps famous Macmillan quote, what stopped you from doing what you wanted? Well, events, my dear boy, events. I don't know if he ever said it, but that seems to have been the case, of course, in the last 2 months, and especially in the last month with COVID, that of course no one saw coming. So that has a tendency of messing up the best of agendas, events. I mean, perhaps looking forward into the next year, Richard, you can share some of your expectations. I mean, you mentioned sort of the great power rivalries that have made life particularly difficult in this year. I mean, I don't think anybody expects this to go away miraculously with the Biden administration. But at the same time, of course, events have repercussions. And so maybe you can share your view on what to expect in the coming months, in the next year. Will we see more leeway, more room to maneuver, or a sort of reinvigorated Security Council, in your opinion?
I certainly think that, you know, Security Council diplomats are looking forward to working with Biden. You know, the last 2 years, as I say, have been really painfully frustrating. And there have been periods in which, you know, the Trump administration has not even been sending proper instructions to its representatives in New York on how to deal with issues like Yemen. You know, the US diplomatic system has really been breaking down. And so everyone, including even some rivals of the US like China, actually say they want to work with a more predictable US again. And so I think, you know, there will be quite a lot of goodwill towards Biden. I don't think it will be easy for Biden to break through a lot of the difficult diplomacy we've seen about Syria, or that we've seen about Ukraine. I don't think we're going to see big advances on some of those really, really difficult crises. But I do think that Biden is going to change the tone and change the US approach when it comes to some of the broad thematic questions on the Security Council agenda. So to take one example that's very strongly linked to the German term, the Trump administration flatly refused to accept a German proposal for a resolution on conflict and climate change. Germany, with 9 other council members, I think actually did a very good bit of homework, preparing a resolution, you know, calling on the UN to provide more data on the links between climate and conflict, to appoint a special representative to look at this issue. The Germans took that to the US in May or June, and the US simply said, no, we are not going to pass. I mean, I think that their literal position was, we are not going to pass a resolution that contains the word climate change. Don't worry about the substance, don't worry about the ideas, just we're not going to do this. Now, Biden has made it crystal clear that one of his overarching foreign policy themes is going to be the fight against climate change. That's why he's appointed John Kerry as an envoy on climate. And so I would think that in the next year, you're going to see the US team probably take elements from the German resolution and either table a resolution of its own or get friendly countries to table a resolution on climate and conflict. I think it's safe to say that although the Chinese and Russians wouldn't like that very much, they would probably accept it because they don't want to offend Biden on a symbolic issue. And so all of a sudden you might actually see what Germany has been trying to do come to fruition, even though Germany has left the council. And I've been teasing your diplomats here for some time that they're going to be really annoyed through 2021 because Norway and Ireland, who are taking up council seats, will get progress on issues that Germany couldn't get progress on. So actually, I do see some glimmers of hope in 2021. And I think that, you know, we should probably reconvene in a year and see to what extent some of those legacy issues like German work on climate have actually fed into council debates as Biden comes in. Because it might turn out that actually the German term had more influence, you know, seen from that perspective than it does in the moment.
Richard, does your cautious optimism extend to UN reform, the R word? I mean, when you look at the debate, it's certainly, you know, almost a decade old, and really nothing much has happened in terms of reforming the Security Council and other UN institutions. It seems like a nightmare without an end. And at the same time, when you look at current statements, it's really the Premier League of voices who have weighed into this debate. This goes far beyond an academic ivory tower kind of self-obsessed discussion with Chancellor Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, you know, voices from India and Japan really calling urgently for a reform of the Security Council and the UN in general. how optimistic are you that anything is going to happen there in the coming, say, 4 years?
Well, I can give you a short answer and I can give you a long answer. The short answer is that nothing is going to happen in the next 4 years. The long answer is that I think, unfortunately, the last few years have actually seen the prospects for Security Council reform decrease. And I would highlight, two countries that I think are real obstacles to Germany achieving its goals of a permanent seat or an EU seat. One is China. In the last few years, Chinese diplomats in New York have become really very, very frank about the fact that they will not accept any council reform that in any way increases Japan's influence in UN affairs. And I think sotto voce, behind the scenes, they actually would say the same thing about India. And because Germany is part of a group of countries pushing for reform with Japan and with India, there's really virtually no chance of progress at all because Beijing is going to block it. I don't think Beijing cares very much about whether Germany has a permanent seat. Relations between the Chinese and German missions have not been easy in the last couple of years, not least because Ambassador Heusgen has been very outspoken on the Uyghur issue. But I mean, that isn't what China worries about. China worries about having Japan find a way to get a permanent seat in the council. And publicly and privately, the Chinese are lobbying extraordinarily hard to kill off Security Council reform. I think that actually is going to be a theme for next year because India is entering the council, and we hear already that Indian and Chinese diplomats have very poor relations, partially because of events in the Himalayas, but also I think because of this reform question. The other country that I think is in the way is actually France. And I think that, probably one of the more negative stories of the last is that the German mission has found that while France was keen to cooperate in public, the French were not really ready to treat Germany as a total equal in Security Council affairs. Back in 2018, Berlin suggested that it could share responsibility for oversight of Security Council with, and France said, no, that's a French territory, sort of diplomatic territory. And through the term, actually, I think the German and French teams have found it quite difficult to co-op issues. And actually, the French have really been focusing a lot, especially in the last year, on their P5 state, more closely with the Russians. Macron and Putin were talking at P5 leaders some point this year. I think that for the Germans here, this was a little disappointing. So the idea of an EU seat, or France Europeanizing its seat, which is something that we've heard from Berlin, just doesn't seem very likely. And actually, just to end on a topic that, as an Englishman in New York, I hate talking about, but Brexit. One of the most interesting facets of the German term is that actually the UK mission and the German mission here have got on very well. Cooperation between the Brits and the Germans has actually been better than cooperation between France and Germany on a lot of Security Council affairs. In part, I think, because being outside the EU now, despite all the problems over the withdrawal, actually British and German diplomats have been able to find a lot of common ground on issues in Africa and so on that they want to work on together.
Thanks, Richard. Before I open the floor, I would like to add one more question, and then I would like to invite all our participants to chip in and share your comments or share any questions that you might have. Richard, what you mentioned about German and French cooperation or failure thereof does not extend to the alliance of multilateralism. And so my last question is, what role do you see for these attempts to sort of sidestep established channels? I mean, in large parts, I suppose it's fair to say that the alliance of multilateralism, this German-French initiative, is an attempt to sort of get around Donald Trump and the functionalities of US inaction. What role do you see for the alliance now that a transatlanticist or multilateralist is back in the White House? Is the mission accomplished? Can we shelve this, or do you see something else that's on the agenda? Maybe you could also comment on these ideas that have been floating around for some time now about, an alliance of democracies, a D10, new fora for democracies who not only share interest but also values. What role do you see for these kind of ideas to take off further in the coming years?
So I think the Alliance for Multilateralism definitely did have value in the last few years, and I think, as you imply, part of that value was symbolic. It was just, significant that you could get 60 countries to come together and show some commitment to revitalizing multilateralism in a dark time. I actually think that the alliance probably has enduring value too, but as a sort of intergovernmental think tank isn't quite the right word, but ideas network. I think that the alliance is actually quite a smart mechanism for countries that are interested in promoting multilateral cooperation on issues like artificial intelligence or cyber, to share ideas, develop notions, and then put them into the UN system or put them into other more formal frameworks. So I do hope that it will continue, because I think it's been a small success, but a success. I think the question of the D10, the question of a new democratic sort of bloc, possibly built on top of the G7, which is what the UK is implying they would like to do next year, that is potentially more problematic. I think that you will find that especially non-Western democracies such as India would want to be part of that grouping. But when it comes to the UN, when it comes to discussing human rights, when it comes to discussing many issues actually in New York and Geneva, Delhi is in a very different place to Berlin or London or the Biden administration. On a lot of issues in the Security Council in the past, we found that actually, Delhi's strategic perception is closer to Russia's than it is to ours. So I think that it would, I think the idea of expanding the G7 is a good one. I mean, I can see value in that. I think that it would give some life to a format that otherwise, risks looking irrelevant. But I don't think that this will transform global governance in the way that some of its advocates hope that it will.
I mean, if that comment is permitted, not all democracies are the same, and the assumption that miraculously they share every interest is perhaps slightly naive. That is at least something that we can witness in the European Union. And we have been able to witness it in the European Union for the last months and years, that commonality of interest only goes so far. Anyways, I would thank you so much, Richard, for these introductory remarks. I think they went well beyond mere introductions. But I would like to invite everyone to come forward. Maybe just raise your hand electronically if you like. And that way we can invite you to share a comment that you might have or a question that you might have. You are also invited, of course, to use the chat function and just sort of make yourself noticeable in the chat function, and then I'm happy to give you the floor. And if nobody has a question at this point, then let me be a little bit more specific about Germany, Richard. I mean, when we had a quick chat just before we started today, we reminisced a little bit about an interview we did some years ago where Richard mentioned or said a sentence that apparently the German ambassador at the UN likes to quote now and then, which is Germany is paying for the drinks at the UN. It's the kind of guest that also brings a lot of wine. But that really hasn't transformed into any greater prospects of a permanent security seat. So, I mean, you know, from a German perspective, is it, and rather from your perspective, Richard, is it even worth it? I mean, why spend capital on something that is unlikely to ever materialize?
I'm happy to answer that. I think I actually saw Marius Müller-Henning trying to raise his hand, or at least I saw his hand. I assume it was raised with intent.
And then we have a couple of other Gerrit Kurz and Mike Zoskar. So
why don't we take a bunch and then I'll
then just try to answer my question as well. Okay, so let me just scroll down. So yeah, so it's Marius and then Judith Vorath, please.
Thanks a lot, Richard, for sure.
Introduce yourself shortly.
Yes, my name is Marius Müller-Hennig and I coordinate FES's European Peace and Security Policy work at FES headquarters in Berlin. And I want to thank Richard a lot for those insights, highly appreciated. And I would have one question on the reform issue, on the reform of the Security Council issue, and it's sort of an thought experiment. So Richard, what would you think if Germany and Japan would jointly, explicitly surrender their own claim for a permanent seat on the Security Council and push, nevertheless, for a reform of the Security Council that would increase the representation, especially with permanent representatives from Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia? Would that be a game changer, or would it just be a little bit more difficult for China and other veto players to, well, argue for their, well, veto position?
Thank you, Marius. Judith Vorath, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, Richard and everybody else. My name is Judith Vorath. I'm from the German Institute of International Security Affairs, SWP, researcher in the International Security Division. I was going to ask as well, is it really worth it? But what's your perspective on that? But more concretely, maybe, what are the key entry points from your perspective now that when Germany is out of the Security Council to pursue, especially maybe the agenda items you mentioned further, to support improvements or, you know, progress on these? You mentioned the Sudanese transition and Libya and so on. Do you see specific entry points beyond the relationship to the UK with incoming members and the P5? Where do you, and also where specifically do you see leverage in the, you know, kind of working mode of the Security Council beyond that? Do you think there's any particular things from specific sanctions or whatever that Germany could use where the influence actually lasts beyond the 2 years? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks very much for those questions. Richard, do you want to have a go at them and then we go do another round of questions?
Yeah, okay, I'll start with Marius's and then I'll come back to the two about finding leverage. It is an interesting thought experiment. I think that it would be possible to persuade, well, I mean, firstly, I can imagine Germany stepping back from its bid. I find it harder to imagine Japan stepping back from its claim to a permanent seat, not least because it would be a sort of symbolic defeat. You know, and frankly, I remember being in Tokyo 5 or 6 years ago and talking to officials there, and they said, you know, we know we're not going to get this. But during the period of the Prime Minister Abe, Tokyo was trying to show that it was a, you know, a serious power, and relinquishing its claim to a council seat would have run against that narrative. Maybe easier now that Abe has stood down, but I'm not sure. I think that you will never persuade India to back away from its claim. And I do think that India is going to be pushing its claim quite hard over the next 2 years. Brazil, it's hard to talk about Brazil at the UN at the moment because under Bolsonaro, it's such a weird power, frankly. But certainly India wouldn't step back. Would it change the dynamic? I think that it might change the dynamic if you were to do some sort of serious preparatory work with the African group, for example. This is something which I know, I see Alicia Kugel is here, she wrote about for FES some time ago. If you could persuade the Africans to move away from their currently rather sort of deadlocked approach to council reform, then possibly you could create some sort of alliance for a new approach. But I would caution that you might also find that Germany and Japan could change their positions and everyone would just say, well, goodbye Germany and Japan, we will now continue to debate this indefinitely. To Judith, what can Germany do to follow up on its council work? I mean, you know, firstly on Libya, it would be good to see actually, you know, given that there has been some progress on Libya in the last few months, you know, there is more of a sort of a ceasefire than we've seen for a while. I mean, Germany should really try and pick that up and pursue that, but primarily, I think, in the EU context. You know, ultimately, the Security Council provides the backing for UN mediation, but to get peace in Libya, you need a consolidated European approach, and unfortunately, you also need to sort of try and work out some sort of deal with Turkey and the Emiratis about what to do in Libya. But I think that Germany should continue to push the issue. You could imagine holding another Berlin conference 1 year on, or a little further on after the initial Berlin conference. I think a lot of activism and a lot of efforts to try and coordinate the EU approach would be useful. And I think it would actually also be welcome to the Biden administration. You know, Washington's position on Libya has been chaos for the last couple of years. There have been real internal divisions in the US system about how to deal with the conflict. I think Biden will want to solve that, and he'll want a strong European partner in dealing with that. So Germany can focus on that outside the council. On Sudan, you know, to be quite honest, what Sudan needs is money. The pathway to peace in Sudan, and I see Peter Schumann nodding, so I hope I'm right. The path to peace and a civilian transition in Sudan really lies through saving the country from a massive budgetary collapse. And that is always very, very close to happening. And so I think that Germany as a major funder, and especially a funder that will probably gain significance during a period when a lot of other donors are cutting back their funding, can actually help direct international engagement with Khartoum by using its financial clout, both bilaterally but also through the you know, through the UN agencies working with Khartoum. So I mean, I do hope Germany will stay focused there as well. You know, we could go through other examples, Afghanistan, etc. But more broadly speaking, you know, I think that in the next few years, you know, overall Germany's significance on security issues in the UN will reduce because it's outside the council. But I think that the real debates that are coming up in the UN, frankly, aren't going to be happening in the council at all. They're going to be happening around climate, and they're going to be happening around the economic fallout of COVID and the problems of inequality that you know, are becoming more and more glaring, especially in the context of the pandemic. And Germany, as a major economic player globally, I think can actually, you know, be a very hefty, very serious player in both the climate debates and the economic debates. So I think you're going to have to sort of repurpose your UN diplomacy a bit away from security back to economics and climate. But I do think that you still have weight on those issues. And I also feel that the council experience has notably improved the quality of German diplomacy in New York, and I hope that that is something that will be maintained post-council.
Thanks, Richard. We have more questions or comments. The next one up would be Gerrit Kurz from the DGAP.
Yes, thanks a lot, and hi, Richard. So I'm Gerrit Kurz. I work at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. I have two questions to you, two issues. The The first one concerns the appointment of SRSGs, because that, for some missions at least, has been quite difficult, and including for issues that are close to Germany, where Germany leads in Security Council, Libya and Sudan. Now there is one for Libya, but there's still no SRSG for UNITAMS, like 2 weeks or a bit more before the mission is supposed to be operational. So maybe you could shed some light on these fights, because I understand it's not just about these countries there. And the second point is about issues that are not formally on the agenda of the Council. Situations like in Cameroon, for example, French, of course, Mozambique, or now Ethiopia in recent weeks. You know, what's been your experience specifically now with regard to Germany, but perhaps also broader elected members, the role that they can play there, also given, of course, that they leave eventually. Yeah, these are my.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gerrit. The next one up is Michael Bröning.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Broska is my name. I'm from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And I would like to ask you about your observations, why Germany wasn't successful in getting a resolution on climate change, or at least a presidential statement on climate change. Who were the main countries opposing that? Could Germany have done more in preparing such endeavor, building more consensus following the Swedish membership in the Security Council? And what could Germany do, or should Germany at all try to, maybe in the next round, support such a resolution?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Richard, do you want to have a go at those questions? And then I'm just scanning the chat function here because I've been given some other questions in writing. You go first.
Okay, I'll take those in reverse order. So Michael, on the climate resolution, you know, firstly, I would draw a comparison between what happened in 2019, when Germany, you know, nearly fell into a massive hole because it was pushing a resolution on sexual violence in conflict, which the US opposed because of a tiny bit of language that the US said endorsed abortion. And that did turn into a big mess because you know, Germany kept on pushing and daring the US to veto. And at the end of the day, you know, Heiko Maas was in New York. You know, Amal Clooney was there, I think, to address the council, and the US simply said, "You take the language out, or we will veto, and we will embarrass you in the Security Council." And so Germany had to retreat, and it had to take out that language. And I think that was a tough learning experience for the mission. And so on climate, we could see from the end of last year that Germany was moving much more cautiously because it knew there was a very high risk that anything it tabled on climate would meet a US veto. And at the end of the day, that is what happened. You know, as I say, in May or June, Kelly Craft, I think, the US ambassador, said to Christoph Heusgen, "We are just not accepting this resolution. Whatever you do with it, you know, whatever the substance is, Washington is not going to accept a resolution containing the words climate and change." And so, you know, in essence, I don't think there was any way around that at all. There was no sort of clever diplomatic solution that Germany could pursue that would have overcome this very strong opposition from the US. I think what Germany's sort of strategy then became, recognizing that, was to show that there was a majority of support in the council for doing something on climate. You know, 9 other members supported its resolution, including not only the UK and France, but also, you know, Caribbean members, Vietnam. They got a solid block. They persuaded, I think, the Chinese indicated that they would have accepted the resolution if the US hadn't blocked it. The Russians were always a bit less clear. but nonetheless, I think actually what Germany did was basically create a consensus around the need for a resolution and for more action on climate change. But that consensus did not extend to the US. And in essence, that was a bet. It was a bet that next year you would have a US administration which would be willing to work further on climate. So I actually think that under the extreme limitations of working with Trump, it was not a bad approach. One small positive benefit of this process was that council members have now established an expert group, a group of diplomats working on climate and conflict, discussing how the Security Council should address climate change in its mandates and resolutions. Actually, all council members are now participating in that, even including the Chinese and Russians. And I think that Germany could continue to support that expert group from the outside, not through governmental interventions, but through channeling the work of German think tanks, German researchers such as yourselves, on our evolving understanding of how climate change is shaping conflict. And I think that if Germany is outside the council, lobbying for more serious discussions, it can build on its legacy, but it needs to bring ideas to the process, and that's where many of you on this call can contribute. Gerrit, on the SRSG issue, I mean, this is indicative of an increasing breakdown of just day-to-day diplomacy in the council in the last couple of years, which ultimately I think is rooted in the high level of tension amongst the P5 that we've been referring to. But you've had a series of occasions on which P5 members or other groups of council members have essentially blocked Guterres appointing people that he would like to see as his special representatives, or at least delaying the process indefinitely. I think it's indicative of a much bigger problem in the UN, which is that in the last 10 years in particular, member states have stopped viewing UN officials as impartial international civil servants, and instead they treat UN posts as patronage posts. And I think that's something which we see spreading further and further across the system, and it's making it harder for the UN to choose the senior leaders that it wants. Sudan is a slightly exceptional case. There, the problem is that the different factions in Khartoum, the military faction and the civilian faction, just cannot seem to find anyone who's mutually acceptable to both of them. And it's really, I think this has been a huge headache for the German mission through the last year, which is on a lot of issues. Factional politics in Khartoum have made it very hard to know what Sudan will accept and what Sudan will want. And that has been holding up the process of getting UNITAMs going that you describe. On issues that are not on the council agenda, I mean, I have to say the last 2 months as someone working around the council have been very, very depressing, because we've had 2 major conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh and Ethiopia, where there is a clear case for Security Council engagement, but the US has been missing in action because of the elections, and other council members, even though they've actually the P5 have been willing to think about engaging in both cases, just haven't been able to get their positions together. Nagorno-Karabakh actually is one that I would highlight probably as a failure of German diplomacy, because on Nagorno-Karabakh, Germany and other council members basically accepted that Russia, France, and the US, as the co-chairs of the Minsk group, should shape all of the UN response to what was going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And everyone basically waited. Russia tabled a statement calling for a ceasefire. The Turks, behind the scenes, persuaded some council members to block that statement. It was an ugly process, but people were asking me, where is Germany in this story? Where is the EU in this story? And as far as I could see, the answer was nowhere. And I think that sort of reflects a broader failure by the European Union to really have any weight in what's happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. So actually, that's one case where I think German diplomacy didn't contribute much at the Security Council, and I think there's a need for some reflection on why the EU was basically absent in a conflict in the European neighborhood.
Thank you, Richard. There's certainly an ugly little war, to use the term, and probably one of the first wars to be fought with drones playing a major decisive role. I wanted to mention another question that has reached me through the chat function, and this is about the Middle East. We just heard that change was denied in terms of climate change by the US, but certainly change was achieved in a bit of an unlikely spot in the last couple of years in the Middle East, with diplomatic progress in terms of recognition of Israel. And now we have the latest step in this sort of pursuit of the greatest peace deal ever of the Trump administration, where sort of in this deal, the US recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara has changed things. And so the question that was posed in the chat function was, okay, what does this mean for the Security Council? Maybe you can comment on that. Actually, two people asked this question. So,
okay, so I was sounding briefly like Darth Vader on the feedback, but now I think I'm okay. Yeah, look, on the Middle East peace process, the explicit goal of the Trump administration was to cut the Security Council out of discussions of Israel and Palestine. You know, if you read the Kushner peace plan, which Jared Kushner came to promote in New York back in February, it says frankly that the Security Council should stay out of dealings with Israel until the US is able to define a peace agreement, and then it should simply step in to endorse it as a formality. And more generally, the Trump administration has cut funding to UN relief efforts for Palestinians. It has done everything it can to minimize the UN's role, because it sees the UN as an obstacle to an agreement that would suit Israel's terms. So actually the Abraham Accords, while I think overall, and maybe until Morocco, one would argue that these were positives. And actually in the case of Sudan, Sudan sort of opening up to Israel has opened the way for more assistance to the transition. Nonetheless, frankly, this was all happening away from the UN, and you could welcome it, but the UN was not part of the story. Now the other side of that story, of course, was the US trying to ramp up pressure on Iran, and in August and September that culminated in the US attempting to snap back UN sanctions on Iran. A incredibly complex story that ultimately led nowhere. And actually, I would say, and I said it in the article that I wrote for you prior to this meeting, that Germany's probably clearest foreign policy success in 2020 in the Council was working with the E3, was working with the Chinese, was working with the Russians to stop the US snapping back sanctions on Iran. And because Germany was able to block the US in that case, the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, survives. It survives in a very poor state, but it is still alive as Biden comes into office. So, frankly, I think the UN has not been relevant to most of what's been happening with Israel, but Germany used its council seat, I think, successfully to defend the Iranian nuclear deal. That would be my summary of the Middle East story in New York. The Western Sahara issue is deeply problematic. I mean, but as Berlin is very well aware, diplomacy on Western Sahara has been pretty futile for a long time. I think what we'll see on that file is basically everyone in the Security Council and General Assembly Just waiting out Trump and then see if Biden can find some sort of formula to walk back Trump's decision on Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. The Security Council doesn't actually have to debate the issue substantively, I think, until the second half of 2021. So everyone is basically just hiding and hoping that it will go away. Yeah, that's pretty much all one can say on the subject.
Thank you, Richard. If there's any other comments or final questions, then now is a good time to ask them. And if that is not the case, I would like to thank you, Richard, very much for your time, and I would like all of you and wherever you are for your participation and for joining us today. This is the end of today's discussion, but it's certainly not the end of the discussion of the future prospects of the United Nations. And when you are in Germany, you can look forward to tomorrow, because I don't know if you're aware, but Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is going to speak in the Bundestag tomorrow. So we all have something to look forward to. Let's see what happens tomorrow in Berlin. And it's my pleasure to wish you all a very fine end or the rest of the day, wherever you are. Thank you once again for joining us. It's been my pleasure. And I think that what Richard shared with us was extremely enlightening and very, very helpful. Thank you, Richard, once again. And all the best to everyone. Happy holidays and stay safe and sane in that order.
Happy holidays.